Manchester City have won just one of their last 12 matches in all competitions. They are bottom of the Premier League form table, below Ipswich, Leicester and Southampton. The title is gone, the top four is in doubt, and the Citizens are even at risk of dropping out of the Champions League, having won just 2 of their 6 group stage games. I'll be honest with you, I didn't see it coming. Over the last 7 years, Manchester City have been the strongest and the most consistent team in Europe. Their 6 league titles during that time puts them level with Bayern Munich and PSG, 2 teams who compete in what are supposed to be one-team leagues, and although Real Madrid have won 3 Champions Leagues, they've also only won 3 La Liga titles, and they have suffered successive round of 16 exits over the last 7 years, whereas Man City haven't once failed to reach at least the quarterfinals of the Champions League, while reaching the same number of finals. They have won a domestic treble in the 2018-19 season, a feat which Sir Alex Ferguson previously described as being impossible. They won a continental treble in the 2022-23 season, becoming only the second English club after Ferguson's Man United in the 1998-99 season to do so, and just last season, Pep Guardiola's side made history yet again, becoming the first English club in the 136-year history of the Football League to win 4 successive top-flight league titles. An unstoppable juggernaut, Pep's Man City have defied the rules and norms, at least of English football, creating a sense of inevitability about them. Even when Arsenal and Liverpool had substantial points advantages over them in the Premier League table, there was a fear, an awe if you like, about Man City, that while others would wobble, they would inescapably hit a run of ungodly form, winning 8, 9 or even 10 games on the bounce, ending the season with yet another title, and often with points tallies that were either rare or outright unprecedented in the Premier League before Pep's arrival. All of a sudden, though, in Guardiola's 9th season at Manchester City, that veil of invincibility is gone. Right now, there is a similar inevitability around their inability to win games. Having never previously suffered more than 3 defeats in a row, or gone more than 6 games without a win over the course of his entire 15-plus year career in management, Pep's Man City have lost 5 in a row this season, they have gone 7 games without a win, and as I said, they have won just 1 of their last 12 matches in all competitions. As a rule, I like to reserve these what on earth are going on videos for clubs that are in genuine turmoil, both on but especially off the pitch, rather than just out of sorts super teams. Liverpool or Real Madrid suffering back-to-back defeats is less interesting to me, and I imagine to most of you, than a Serie B side being taken over by a Belarusian oligarch who turns out not to exist, and their training ground being turned into a Russian nuclear weapons base directed at Western Europe. I should clarify, that is a hypothetical example. I don't want any of you to waste your time searching for the Serie B nuclear base video. Man City's run of form is so extraordinary though, on par with almost any shock of the Premier League era, outside of Leicester City winning the league, and of course, it is taking place amidst a backdrop of more than 100 charges being brought against them by the Premier League, which, among other things, allege serious financial and accounting crimes. So, seeing as though it's Christmas, and about 5,000 people have messaged or commented asking me to do it, today we are going to take a look at Manchester City's spectacular collapse this season, the reasons behind it, whether we, and more importantly, whether they should have seen it coming, and whether it is only a poor run of form, or just the start of something much more malignant. It is worth starting this video by noting that football is cyclical. As Pep Guardiola has said many times, both during periods of unrelenting success and during Man City's recent slump, his teams cannot win every game and every title, even if it might have seemed like it at times. At some point, that had to stop. No team keeps winning forever. What is abnormal about Manchester City and Pep Guardiola isn't the fact that they have hit a poor patch of form after 6 Premier League titles in 7 seasons. It is the fact that they won 6 Premier League titles in 7 seasons without suffering a single sustained period of poor form and poor results throughout that time. It should also be noted that, as tends to be the case, there is an element of poor fortune. Manchester City didn't go from being the most dominant team over a 5, 6 and 7 year period that English football has ever seen, and powerhouses in Europe, to being worse than Nottingham Forest and Brentford purely through a case of deep-rooted incompetence that suddenly manifested itself overnight. Rodri's ACL injury, most notably, is a devastating blow to the reigning Ballon d'Or winner, with whom both mentally and actually just statistically, there was a sense in which Man City couldn't lose, but the Spaniard isn't the only notable absentee at the Etihad this season. Oscar Bob, who was Man City's star man in pre-season, convincing the club that they had a ready-made replacement for the departing Julian Alvarez, fractured his leg in a freak accident during a non-contact training session in August, ruling him out for at least the first half of the season. Kevin De Bruyne's injury problems, now threatening to become a worrying theme, have continued this season, depriving the citizens of the primary creative force in their team. Phil Foden has already suffered 2 injury setbacks this season. Ruben Dias, Manuel Akanji and Nathan Ake, arguably 3 of Man City's strongest back 4, are all currently, or in Ake's case, maybe currently sidelined. Meanwhile, John Stones and Mateo Kovacic have only recently recovered from spells on the treatment table, which they shared briefly with Jeremy Doku. Every team seems to have hard luck stories when it comes to injuries. Every manager will tell you that their current injury crisis is the worst that they've ever experienced, and worse than any other team's. But this is genuinely probably the worst injury crisis that Pep Guardiola has ever had, and among the worst in the Premier League. Football is also a game of very fine margins. Man City may only have won 1 of their last 12 games, but it could just as easily have been 4 or 5 if just a couple of fateful moments had played out slightly differently. Against Feyenoord in the Champions League, for example, Man City were 3-0 up after 75 minutes, but 14 minutes of sheer madness turned the game on its head, as they became the first team to ever give up a 3-0 lead that late in a game in the Champions League. Against Brighton, Man City should have been out of sight at half-time, and in previous seasons they would have been, but instead they went in at only 1-0 up and ended up losing the game 2-1. And against Manchester United, without looking particularly impressive, Man City still looked comfortable, sitting on a 1-goal advantage from the 36th minute onwards, until, in a complete brain fart, Mateus Nunes attempted to redeem himself from his own misplaced pass by taking out Amad Diallo in the area, giving away a penalty, from which Man United equalised before Diallo bagged an injury-time winner. All of these little moments of madness and misfortune have played their part in Man City's unprecedented poor form, and after enough of these things start to go against you, it begins to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It is evident that the Man City squad is currently drained of all confidence and self-belief, despite having won 4 successive league titles, and that is partly owing to their continued poor form, and partly to do with the different way in which they are beginning to be perceived. For the last 7 years, Man City have been feared and respected in equal measure. Plenty of Premier League teams would be pleased to leave the Etihad with a respectable-looking defeat. Such was the extent of their ruthlessness, and the degree to which they felt untouchable. That fear factor, for now at least, has gone. Not only that, teams sense a nervousness and a vulnerability, which is palpable at the Etihad right now, and in the Premier League, almost every team is capable of exploiting those vulnerabilities and mental fragilities, which is the polar opposite of what we have associated with Manchester City for so long. Those are the mitigating factors, if you like: a dreadful injury crisis, some poor fortune, and a snowballing crisis of confidence for them and of belief for their opponents. But Manchester City aren't getting off that easily. While all of those things have played a part, and a significant one, in where Man City currently find themselves, there are also a number of factors that were within the club's hands, the controllables, as loathsome football executives sometimes like to describe them, which you could question and say that they've got wrong. The injury crisis, for example, is partly a case of bad luck, of course, but it's also the result of Man City competing in about 5 different competitions and reaching the latter stages of almost all of them season upon season with a very small squad and playing with an immense intensity in most of their games. For years, you'd often hear it said that Man City's greatest strength was their depth, and they have often had great and indeed very expensive players on their bench under Pep Guardiola, but they have rarely, if ever, had two great players in every position, as was often alleged. In actual fact, Man City have always maintained a core squad of about 18 or 19 regular first-team players, complemented typically by academy graduates. That's not because of league registration rules or financial constraints. Financial constraints? What are they? But it is by design. Pep Guardiola likes small squads. They are more manageable, you can keep everyone on side because all of your senior players are always involved, you are less likely to have the disruption of players becoming disillusioned or going to their agents and attempting to leave mid-season, and for all of the criticism on this front, Guardiola is someone who likes giving academy players opportunities, even if he favours gradually bedding them in. It's also the case that Guardiola's football is very regimented and positionally disciplined, and it is easier to create a full understanding of those requirements and everyone's roles within the team with a smaller, more tight-knit group of players. For the same reason, you rarely see enormous turnover from Pep season to season, and the vast majority of players take a season to fully familiarise themselves with his management and tactical demands, rather than hitting the ground running. Erling Haaland was, of course, a very notable exception. Speaking in 2023, Pep said, quote, "When you have 20 players and 6 injuries, they say you should have a bigger squad. But what happens when I don't have injuries? How can I manage that? I can play just 11. If 14 don't play for a long time, I don't want to be a manager. Every new player is a transfer or salary. That's why when you recruit, you have to look for players who can play in 2 or 3 positions. Bernardo can do that, Phil, Julian, Oscar Bob. When people say they want 2 players for every position, I don't agree with that. To be effective, you have to be starting regularly. If I want less games, I will manage teams not in European competitions. It will be long weeks. When you are in a top team in European competitions, we have to accept it. In 12 to 13 years as a manager, I have lived that all the time." End quote. This month, Guardiola rode back on those comments somewhat, stating in relation to the congested football calendar, quote, "It made me reflect. Maybe you need a squad of 25, 30 players. It'd be more difficult financially for the club, but today we're going to play the Club World Cup in the summer for 3 weeks, start again the Premier League. Maybe we have to have more depth." End quote. Guardiola ended by concluding that, with the current options available to him, Man City, quote, "couldn't compete." Nonetheless, Pep went on to reiterate his initial position that if he goes out and buys a 6th or 7th centre-back, what happens when the 3 who are currently injured return? It is interesting to contrast Guardiola's and, by extension, Manchester City's strategy on this issue with Chelsea's, who were widely considered to be a basket case prior to the start of this season, but he may now feel partially vindicated this term. We shouldn't get too carried away there. They have spent an absolute fortune and had been abject for the last couple of seasons, but it's an interesting contrast to observe. Enzo Maresca, who was of course formerly a youth team coach, and Pep Guardiola's assistant at Manchester City, has the exact problem that Pep describes. A big squad, lots of very highly paid first team players who want to play games, and, inevitably, lots who don't get to very often because you can only start 11 each week. The likes of Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall, Axel Disasi, and even Joao Felix are just 3 players, signed for a combined £114 million, who have barely featured in the Premier League this season. By the same token, however, when Enzo Maresca has been without players this season, which has included the likes of Wesley Fofana, Romeo Lavia, Mikhailo Mudryk, and sadly, all too predictably Reece James, he has had no lack of alternatives waiting in the wings. Pep Guardiola, by contrast, was forced to hand 18-year-old Jamai Simpson-Pouze a first Premier League start at centre-back much earlier than anticipated against Brighton this season, and although teams are allowed to name 12 substitutes on their bench in the Champions League now, Man City were only able to name 7 against Sparta Prague in October, just a week before their dreadful run of form began, and 2 of those, Ederson and Scott Carson, were both goalkeepers. Academy graduates James McAtee and Nico O'Reilly were both introduced from the bench in that game. it would be facile to make sweeping statements like, "You can't hope to compete in modern football with a squad that size," when, as we've already established, Man City haven't just consistently competed with a small squad in recent years, they have won a treble and 4 straight Premier League titles with one. It is true, however, that the football calendar is only becoming more congested with the expansion of the Champions League and the introduction of the FIFA Club World Cup this season, along with bloated international competitions. And if you combine an injury crisis with an aging squad and going deep in most of those competitions, you are likely to hit a wall at some point. We hear a lot about the intensity of managers like Antonio Conte, Jose Mourinho, and even Marcelo Bielsa, and how their methods and intense demands can only work for a certain number of years, before players become mentally and physically fatigued and require some kind of a change. Conte, famously, in 11 different jobs, has never lasted more than 3 seasons at a single club, despite being incredibly highly regarded and successful. Few managers, however, if any, are more intense and demanding, both physically but especially mentally, in terms of discipline, positioning, and executing a plan, than Pep Guardiola. And we tend to forget that he only lasted 4 years managing Barcelona, where he missed out on the La Liga title for the first time, to Jose Mourinho's Real Madrid in his final season in charge, before he felt that he needed to take a year-long sabbatical from management, temporarily relocating to New York to recover and recharge his batteries, followed by just 3 years at Bayern Munich. This is Pep's 9th season at Man City, but while his players look to be struggling with the physical and mental intensity, and Pep looks like he could desperately benefit from another year out of the sport, he has just signed a new 2-year extension to stay at the Etihad until 2027. That was framed as a show of faith at the time, amidst Manchester City's Premier League charges and reports of possible expulsion from the league, which was supposed to galvanise the entire club. But just 2 days later, Man City were hammered 4-0 by Tottenham in possibly their worst performance of the season. The delay in Guardiola making the decision to extend his contract caused Manchester City another problem, though, for which he and the club are almost wholly to blame. The powers that be at Manchester City have known for some time now that they were coming towards the end of a cycle with some key members of the club's squad, and that a rebuild of sorts was required. Kyle Walker is 34 and has almost become the poster boy of Man City's decline this season, looking to have lost that half a yard of pace upon which he has always been so reliant. Kevin De Bruyne is 33 and having missed the first half of last season with a hamstring injury, the same injury has already restricted his game time so far this season, and Ilkay Gundogan is 34 and hasn't quite had the impact that some might have hoped, or that he had when he was last at the club, following his return from Barcelona. In fairness to Gundogan, he expected his minutes to be managed this season, brought back partially because of his leadership and experience, but because of Rodri's ACL injury, among other setbacks, he finds himself being depended on far more than anticipated. Since the 4th game of the season, Gundogan has started in all but one of Man City's matches across both the Premier League and the Champions League, often playing full 90s. There is now a consensus among the hierarchy at Manchester City reportedly that they should have moved Walker on, along with 1 or 2 others, with even Ederson's name having been mentioned, following substantial interest in the summer, coming from Saudi Arabia. In the past, one of Manchester City's greatest strengths has been their dispassionate ruthlessness, forward-thinking, and lack of sentimentality when it comes to squad planning. Whereas rivals Manchester United persisted with the likes of Phil Jones, Anthony Martial and Nemanja Matic, offering them lucrative new contract extensions through fear of losing them for nothing, which would come back to haunt them, Man City maintained a gradual but constant churn, discarding of players who had done far more for them than the likes of Matic had at Old Trafford. Early on in his reign, Pep moved on the likes of Edin Dzeko, Joe Hart, Yaya Toure and Pablo Zabaleta, all of whom had been outstanding servants to the club but weren't part of his plans, later followed by club legends like Vincent Kompany, Sergio Aguero and David Silva. Despite Pep's famous tearful interview in which he insisted that Man City couldn't replace Aguero, in almost all instances, there was a plan in place. Dzeko left with Pep's blessing because Man City had already agreed a deal to sign Gabriel Jesus. Hart was replaced by Claudio Bravo, and when that didn't work out, Edison. By the time that Touré departed, somewhat acrimoniously, he had already lost his place in the team to Pep signings like Ilkay Gundogan and Bernardo Silva, and both Pablo Zabaleta and Gael Clichy were directly replaced by Kyle Walker, Benjamin Mendy and Danilo, who weren't just much younger, but also fit the profile of fullback that Pep wanted at the club. Kompany, meanwhile, arguably wasn't properly replaced, leading to Man City having a much worse defensive record the season after he departed, and missing out on their only league title in the last 7 years to Liverpool. That was quickly rectified, in the summer of 2020, by a more than £100 million investment in Nathan Ake and Ruben Dias, which restored Man City to top spot. Aguero's reduced contribution in his final season made replacing him less urgent, but within 6 months of his move to Barcelona, Man City signed Julian Alvarez, and just 6 months after that, they brought in Erling Haaland. Last season's success allowed for some complacency to creep in. Walker was still quick, De Bruyne looked as good as ever in the run-in after returning from injury, and Pep convinced Edison to stick around despite reportedly striking a verbal agreement on an eye-watering contract in Saudi Arabia. Previously, as soon as a player's head had even been slightly turned, think Leroy Sané, João Cancelo, Aymeric Laporte or Ferran Torres, Pep would get rid. It was partly a show of strength to illustrate that no player is irreplaceable and to deter players who didn't actually want to leave from ever engaging in similar acts of public dissent. There was partly an element of ego, insofar as Pep felt that he could cope with the loss of previously very important players like Sané or Cancelo, and he was invariably proven right, and it was also partly because it presented an economically favourable opportunity to naturally refresh the squad. Sir Alex Ferguson did something very similar. When a player crossed him, with only 2 or 3 very high-profile exceptions in a 30-year career, he would get rid of them, and Fergie felt that even off the back of extraordinary success, whether that be a league title or even a treble, the squad needed refreshing just to keep everyone on their toes and to prevent training, the dressing room, and the atmosphere surrounding the club from going stale. The likes of David Beckham, Roy Keane, Ruud van Nistelrooy and Andy Cole were all ruthlessly moved on by Sir Alex, despite having made immense contributions, and replaced by the likes of Cristiano Ronaldo, Michael Carrick, Wayne Rooney and Diego Forlan. Man City and Guardiola's uncharacteristic short-sightedness wasn't just the result of complacency though, it also came down to the fact that a significant rebuild, which had reportedly been penciled in for the summer of 2024, was pushed back to 2025 owing to Pep Guardiola's contract situation. The Catalan's contract was set to expire at the end of this season, and with Pep unwilling to commit his future to the club, the powers that be at Man City decided that it would be unwise to sanction a full rebuild last summer, in case Pep's replacement, in only 12 months' time, had different ideas about how they wanted to play, and the profile of player that they wanted at the club. The fact that Guardiola has, ultimately, signed a new 2-year extension means that delay was not only damaging, as we are seeing play out so far this season, but also totally pointless. It is perhaps particularly painful for Manchester City fans to look at some of the young players they already had at the club but let go, who would certainly have been very useful this season. Cole Palmer is the outstanding example of that, of course, now one of the best players in the Premier League, if not the entire world, but the likes of Romeo Lavia, Liam Delap, recent England debutant and goalscorer Taylor Harwood-Bellis, Aston Villa star and fellow England international Morgan Rogers, and centre-back Tosin Adarabioyo, who is now a starter at Chelsea, all spent time in Man City's outstanding academy but were allowed to depart. Meanwhile, Julian Alvarez, who played the 9th most minutes of anyone at Man City last season, ahead of Kevin De Bruyne, was sold to Atletico Madrid in the summer. It is easy to be wise after the fact. There weren't many people decrying the sale of Morgan Rogers to Middlesbrough in 2023, after City had just won the treble, as some kind of fatal mistake, and perhaps Rogers wouldn't have developed as he has done with the limited first-team opportunities he likely would have been afforded at the Etihad, but ultimately, it is the job of the coaching and executive team at Man City to make these judgments, and there are 1 or 2 that now appear to have been a little unwise. The good news from a Manchester City perspective is that, unlike a lot of other Big Six clubs, and even the chasing pack, if they can recalibrate and identify proper targets, they are able to spend their way out of this crisis, and they have the regulatory wriggle room to spend more heavily than almost anyone else. Man City have only posted a pre-tax loss in 1 out of the last 10 seasons, and that was the 2019-20 season, heavily impacted by COVID, in which almost every team suffered substantial losses. In the last 3 years, the club has made a pre-tax profit of £196 million, which is the most of any Premier League team during that time. Last season, Man City raised £139 million in player sales, which was not just the most in the Premier League last season, but is the second most that any Premier League team has ever raised in a single season, trailing only Chelsea in the 2019-20 season, and only then by £4 million. Revenue, meanwhile, grew to £715 million, which is both a club and indeed a Premier League record, and the second highest revenue figure worldwide, narrowly trailing Real Madrid. That increase came despite Man City exiting in the quarterfinals of last season's Champions League, having won it the season before that. Unlike a lot of their rivals, therefore, Man City have significant headroom when it comes to navigating both the Premier League's profit and sustainability regulations and UEFA's new squad cost controls. Under the Premier League's existing PSR rules, clubs are allowed to lose a maximum of £105 million over a rolling 3-year monitoring period, minus any deductible expenses. Theoretically then, Man City could lose over £250 million. Yes, that is £250 million British pounds sterling this season, and still not breach the rules. Newly implemented UEFA squad cost controls, meanwhile, mandate that clubs competing in UEFA competitions can spend no more than 70% of their revenue, plus any profit generated on player sales on wages, transfer fees, and agents' fees combined. According to estimates by the Swiss Ramble, Man City are currently operating at around 56%, meaning that they also have more room to spend than almost any other team in Europe, assuming that they can maintain their impressive revenue figures, of course. There are those who doubt the legitimacy of Man City's revenue figures, and who have done for some time, and the club's current poor run of form is taking place amidst a backdrop of scandal and legal battles following 130 charges brought against them by the Premier League. That wasn't a slip of the tongue, in case you'd missed the news. 50 new charges have recently been added to the finalised list of charges, taking the overall figure from 115 up to 130. That was maybe easier to ignore or put off somewhat while the team was still winning, but now it threatens to turn the Citizens into a crisis club both on and off the pitch. I have made an entire video dedicated to Man City's charges, what they are accused of, and the potential ramifications or punishments that they could face, so I won't go over all of that again. The only significant update since then is that we now expect a judgment in either February or March, which either side will be able to appeal. Club insiders say that the risk of a severe punishment if Man City are found guilty hasn't yet been a deterrent for players or agents when it has come to trying to sign them, but the combination of poor results and an imminent ruling, some fear, could prove to be a stumbling block if Man City plan on doing significant work in the January transfer window in a bid to save their season. Pep Guardiola, for what it's worth, has rejected the idea of performing major surgery on his squad mid-season, insisting that what he really needs is his own players back from injury, not new ones brought in from elsewhere. The Citizens are also engaged in a secondary legal battle with the Premier League, why stop at one, relating to associated party transactions, or ATPs, which limits the ability of clubs to accept lucrative commercial deals from companies which have close ties to their ownership. The new rules were approved following Newcastle United's takeover by Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, but heavily impacts Man City, who have already won a partial victory in the courts against the new rules. On the pitch, meanwhile, Man City are still an attacking threat who create a hatful of chances. Despite their dreadful run of form and drop down the league table, they still lead the division in terms of progressive passes, progressive carries, and take-ons leading to shots, and they are third in terms of expected overall goals. It is defensively, however, and in transition, where there has been the biggest difference between Man City this season and in the seasons which preceded it. As has been widely documented now, Pep's side are no longer hunting in packs with real intensity and winning the ball back high up the pitch, which has been one of the few constant hallmarks throughout Guardiola's time in management. They have become even more vulnerable to fast and direct counter-attacks, which have always been their Achilles heel, and they are conceding more chances, more shots on goal, and more expected goals as a result. Having had the second best expected goals against in the Premier League last season, Man City have the 9th worst record in the league so far this season, giving up more chances than the likes of Fulham, Everton, and Crystal Palace. They'd even given up a higher expected goals against than Ange's kamikaze Spurs team until the weekend, when Tottenham conceded 6 against Liverpool. Particular problems for Man City relate to their inability to win duels. They actually have the worst record in terms of the percentage of duels won in the entire division, which is an area where they used to excel. In the fullback positions, where Kyle Walker, Rico Lewis, Josko Gvardiol, or whoever else has played there, has struggled to stop crosses from coming into the box, and most notably of all, partly owing to their injury crisis at centre-back no doubt, they have been absolutely abysmal at defending those balls into the box, and particularly late arrivals at their back post. A less often noted issue which Man City are also facing, I think, is when it comes to disrupting counter-attacks through professional or tactical fouls. Man City have been masters of the tactical foul for some time under Pep, since the days of Fernandinho, and it was often observed that they were very good at getting away with it and escaping harsh punishments. Last season, Man City picked up by far the fewest yellow cards of any team in the Premier League, just 52, which was fewer than half as many as Chelsea. This season, by contrast, whether that is a result of losing Rodri's nous, referees cracking down on tactical fouls more harshly, or a combination of the two, Man City have already picked up 36 yellows, which is 70% as many as they received last season, with less than half of this season gone. Both collectively and individually, Man City's backline have made more errors than ever this season. After giving up a 1-0 lead at the death against Manchester United, Bernardo Silva said that Man City, quote, played like under-15s, to which the Manchester City under-15s reportedly responded, hey, don't bring us into this.
Why they get picked up?
Meanwhile, although Man City are still creating chances, and the underlying data suggests that goals should come with time, Erling Haaland, upon whom they are so reliant for goals, and who will inevitably soon come good again, has only scored 1 goal in his last 6 Premier League appearances, and 3 in his last 12, all of which have been full 90-minute appearances. Phil Foden, who won the Premier League Player of the Season and the PFA Players Player of the Year awards last season, has had injury problems and is yet to really sparkle like we are used to, and there has been a lack of inspiration likewise from the likes of Jack Grealish, Jeremy Doku, and Savinho. The end result is a team which is low on confidence, light on depth, both mentally and physically drained, lackluster in transition, poor at defending their own box, lacks the magic and inspiration to unlock a low block at the other end, and doesn't have a centre-forward averaging a goal a game, which is something that they have become accustomed to over the last couple of seasons. Factor in the poor fortune covered at the beginning, or the non-controllables if you like, and Man City's shocking drop-off becomes a little bit easier to understand. But only a little bit. The reality is, if you look at the 11 that started for Man City at the weekend against Aston Villa, as they suffered a 3rd consecutive defeat for the 2nd time this season, it is still an outstanding team. A back 4 of Rico Lewis, Manuel Akanji, John Stones and Josko Gvardiol may be tired, half-fit and out of sorts, but it's certainly not lacking in talent, nor was it cheaply assembled, with Nathan Ake also on the bench. Rodri may be irreplaceable, and the best player in the world according to Ballon d'Or voting, but a double pivot of Mateo Kovacic and Ilkay Gundogan ought to be enough to control the game against the vast majority of teams. Bernardo Silva, Phil Foden and Jack Grealish formed the creative engine room in a 4-2-3-1 in behind Erling Haaland, with Jeremy Doku, Savinho and Kevin De Bruyne among the substitutes. It would be ridiculous to pretend that Man City haven't had a perfect storm of misfortune, poor planning, and off-field uncertainty causing the extent of their current poor run of form, But it would be equally absurd to suggest that they aren't still capable of fielding one of the strongest starting 11s in world football, which, put bluntly, should still be capable of winning games against a team as talented as Aston Villa, if you were to compare their two starting 11s side by side, let alone Bournemouth, Palace or Feyenoord when they led 3-0 with less than 20 minutes remaining on the clock. Man City are still strong favourites to finish fourth this season, behind Liverpool, Arsenal and Chelsea, and qualify for the Champions League, and I think that still makes sense. Once Pep Guardiola has something resembling a full complement available to him, likely strengthened by at least one, if not two key January reinforcements, by sheer force of the talent available to them, it is hard to see how they don't start winning games again. But the games come thick and fast over the festive period, Everton, Leicester and West Ham all in the next 11 days, followed by a potential embarrassing FA Cup tie against Salford City, who are co-owned by 6 Manchester United legends, and the controversial Singaporean businessman Peter Lim. Whereas a lot of managers try to go back to basics during a difficult spell of form, Guardiola is more likely to obsess over complex solutions to turn the club's fortunes around. Any other manager at a club with Manchester City's expectations going through this run of form would either be on the brink or, more likely, have already lost their job. But Pep is a special case. Despite stating multiple times this season that he doesn't have the solutions, that he isn't good enough, and that, and this is a quote, "Maybe I deserve to be sacked, honestly," end quote, Guardiola probably has enough credit in the bank after 6 Premier League titles and signing a contract extension despite the club's 130 charges that he could finish 17th this season and still keep his job. For younger Manchester City fans, they have witnessed about as many defeats in the last couple of months as they may have done in years previously supporting the club. To them, none of this feels normal. For older Manchester City fans, there must be an element of nostalgia about finally losing again and no longer seeming like invincible and unstoppable juggernauts, even if they would prefer for this spell of form to be brief. For context, Man City are currently 7th in the Premier League table, which is higher than they had ever finished during the Premier League era before Sheikh Mansour bought the club. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, I hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, just as a Christmas present to me, Alfie Potts Armour, both of which, that I was saying the name of the channel, but that is also my name if you're addressing the Christmas present to someone, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on a whole series of social media platforms, the links to which should be available down in the video description below, along with a whole lot of other good stuff. As I say, thank you for watching, and if you celebrate, I hope you have a magnificent Christmas. Cheers.